Gas attendant paid for Undercover owner's fuel, then something amazing happened. The neon sign of Miller's Gas and Go flickered against the darkening sky, its blue and red lights, creating dancing shadows across the cracked asphalt. Located on the outskirts of Pine Grove, a town small enough that everyone knew each other but big enough to stay on the map, the station served as a beacon for both weary travelers and locals running on empty. The building itself had seen better days. Its white paint was peeling in places, and the window decals advertising cigarette brands were faded from years of sun exposure, but it remained a reliable pit stop on Highway 23. Inside the fluorescent-lit convenience store, two men worked the night shift, though worked together might have been too generous a description. Danny Martinez, barely 23, with kind eyes and a ready smile, was restocking the coffee station when he heard his colleague's familiar grumbling from behind the counter. "These kids today think they can just leave their trash everywhere," Greg Wilson muttered, loud enough to ensure everyone would hear, as he aggressively swept potato chip crumbs from the counter. At 52, Greg wore his years like armor, each line on his face seeming to tell a story of disappointment and resentment. His graying hair was always slightly unkempt, as if he couldn't be bothered to make an effort anymore, and his uniform shirt bore permanent coffee stains he'd long stopped trying to remove. Danny glanced at the clock, 9:47 p.m. Greg had been complaining steadily since their shift started at 8, and they still had hours to go. He'd learned early on that attempting to lighten Greg's mood was like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon, futile and likely to leave you exhausted. "You know what your problem is, kid?" Greg called out, not waiting for Danny to respond. "You're too nice. Always smiling, always helping people. The world's gonna eat you alive." Danny continued arranging the coffee cups, making sure they formed neat, even stacks. "Being nice hasn't hurt me so far," he replied mildly. In the 6 months they'd worked together, he'd perfected the art of neutral responses. "Ha!" Greg's laugh was sharp and hollow. "Just wait. 25 years I've worked here. 25 years watching people. They're all the same, looking for angles, trying to get something for nothing. But they don't fool me anymore." The bell above the door chimed, interrupting Greg's monologue. A young woman hurried in, clutching a sleeping toddler to her chest. She looked harried, her hair escaping from a messy ponytail, dark circles under her eyes visible even in the harsh store lighting. "Excuse me." She approached the counter timidly. "Do you have a bathroom?" Before Greg could respond with his usual customers-only speech, Danny stepped forward. "Of course, ma'am. It's right through that door, and I've just cleaned it." He pointed to the back of the store, offering a reassuring smile. The woman's relief was palpable. "Thank you so much. We've been driving for hours and..." She finally fell asleep, and I didn't want to stop at one of those darker places. "Take your time," Danny assured her, already reaching for the bathroom key. Greg watched the interaction with narrowed eyes, waiting until the woman was out of earshot. "There you go again. She hasn't bought anything. Probably won't either. Just using us like a public restroom." Danny shrugged, returning to his tasks. "Maybe she will, maybe she won't. But treating her with kindness costs us nothing. Costs us our dignity." Greg muttered, but his attention was already shifting to another target. Through the window, he spotted a teenager filling up his motorcycle, music bleeding faintly through his headphones. "Look at that, bet he's going to try to pay with a maxed-out credit card. They always do." The prediction proved wrong when the teen came in and paid cash, even buying a candy bar, an energy drink. Greg found fault anyway, complaining about the wrinkled bills and the time it took to count them. As the night wore on, Danny observed his colleague with a mixture of curiosity and concern. There was something almost theatrical about Greg's bitterness, as if he was performing the role of the grumpy old-timer rather than truly living it. Sometimes, in quiet moments when Greg thought no one was watching. Danny caught glimpses of something else, a flicker of loneliness, perhaps, or regret. The woman with the toddler emerged from the bathroom, the child still peacefully sleeping. True to Greg's prediction, she headed for the door without making a purchase. But then she paused, turned back, and quickly grabbed a coffee and some snacks, paying with exact change and thanking Danny again before leaving. Lucky guess, Greg grumbled when Danny glanced his way. One decent customer doesn't prove anything. Danny began wiping down the coffee station, thinking about how to respond. You know, Greg, I've always wondered, what made you stay here for 25 years if you hate it so much? The question seemed to catch Greg off guard. For a moment, his carefully maintained wall of cynicism cracked, revealing something vulnerable underneath. But just as quickly the crack sealed itself. Someone's got to keep this place running, he snapped. Can't all be sunshine and rainbows like you. The night stretched ahead of them, punctuated by the occasional customer and Greg's running commentary on each one's perceived flaws. But Danny had seen that momentary crack in Greg's facade, and it made him wonder what other surprises might be hiding beneath the surface of Miller's Gas and Go. The clock had just struck 11 when they heard it, the distinctive sound of an engine in distress. The noise grew louder as a battered pickup truck limped into the station, its rusty frame shuddering with each rotation of the wheels. The vehicle looked like it had been through a war, with patches of primer showing through faded blue paint and a crack spiderwebbing across the passenger side windshield. Great, Greg muttered from his perch behind the counter. Here comes trouble. He'd developed an almost supernatural ability to predict problems, or perhaps he just decided long ago that everything was a problem waiting to happen. The truck's engine gave one final, wheezing cough before falling silent. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door creaked open with the reluctance of aged metal, and a man emerged slowly, as if carrying an invisible weight on his shoulders. Even from inside the store, Danny could tell this wasn't your typical traveler. The man's clothes seemed to have lived several lives before reaching him, a jacket with frayed cuffs, jeans worn thin at the knees, and boots that had walked too many miles to count. His hair was a tangled mess of silver and gray, and several days' worth of stubble shadowed his face. But there was something about his posture, about the way he carried himself, that caught Danny's attention. I bet he's going to try to pull something, Greg predicted, already tensing for confrontation. Probably claim his credit card isn't working, or spin some sob story about needing gas money. Danny watched as the man approached the store, noting how he seemed to hesitate with each step. There was dignity in his bearing, despite his appearance, the kind of dignity that comes from someone trying very hard to maintain it in difficult circumstances. The bell above the door chimed as the man entered. Up close, the details of his situation became clearer. His clothes, though worn, were clean. His hands, when he removed them from his pockets, showed calluses and recent scrapes, suggesting someone used to work rather than idleness. Most striking were his eyes, clear, intelligent, and filled with what Danny recognized as carefully contained desperation. Excuse me, the man said, his voice soft but steady. He approached the counter, keeping a respectful distance. I find myself in an awkward situation. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. I've lost my wallet somewhere between here and Riverside. I've been driving for hours, trying to reach my sister. She's in the hospital, not doing well. I just need enough gas to make it another 100 miles. Greg's response was immediate and predictable. Yeah, right, he scoffed, not even trying to hide his disdain. Lost wallet, sick relative, never heard that one before. Let me guess. You'll mail us the money once you get there? The man flinched slightly, but maintained his composure. I understand your skepticism. I know how this must sound. But I'm telling you the truth. I can provide my sister's hospital information, my identification number from the police report I filed about the wallet. Save it, Greg interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. We're not a charity. No money, no gas. Simple as that. He turned away, making a show of reorganizing the cigarette display. Behind the counter, Danny had remained quiet during this exchange, studying the man carefully. He noticed small details that Greg, in his rush to judge, had missed. The way the man's hands trembled slightly when he mentioned his sister. The hospital visitor's pass partially visible in his jacket pocket, creased from handling. The genuine pain that flickered across his face at Greg's dismissal. But what really caught Danny's attention was what the man didn't do. He didn't become aggressive or defensive. He didn't raise his voice or make demands. Instead, he nodded, slowly, accepting the rejection with a quiet dignity that spoke volumes. I understand, the man said softly. Thank you for your time. He turned to leave, his shoulders slightly more stooped than when he'd entered. Something clicked in Danny's mind. Before he could second-guess himself, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. Wait, he called out. The man paused at the door. Danny extracted several crumpled bills, money he'd been saving for his community college textbooks. How much do you need? Greg spun around so fast he knocked over a display of lighters. Don't you dare, he warned. Don't you even think about it. But Danny was already moving toward the stranger. It's not much, he said, holding out $40. But it should get you at least halfway there. The man stared at the offered money, emotion washing over his weathered features. I can't accept that. You don't even know me. True, Danny smiled. But I know what it's like to have someone in the hospital and feel helpless about getting there. He thought about his own mother's hospital stays, the countless times they'd struggled with transportation and expenses. Take it. Just promise. You'll help someone else when you can. Greg's voice cut through the moment like a knife. This is ridiculous. He's playing you like a fiddle, kid. How many times do I have to tell you? People are just waiting to take advantage of soft-hearted fools like you. The man still hadn't taken the money. Instead, he looked between Danny and Greg, something unreadable passing across his face. You're very kind, he said to Danny finally, accepting the bills with careful reverence. Both of you have taught me something important tonight. Greg snorted derisively. Yeah? What's that? That there's still suckers in the world? The man didn't respond to the jibe. He simply nodded to Danny, a gesture that somehow conveyed both gratitude and something deeper, almost like approval. Then he turned and walked out, the bell chiming his departure. Through the window, they watched as he filled his truck with the precious fuel. The engine started with the same painful sound, but seemed to run a bit smoother now. As the truck's taillights disappeared into the darkness, Greg launched into his predicted tirade. You've just thrown away $40, he declared. Might as well have flushed it down the toilet. He's probably laughing all the way to the next station, where he'll pull the same con on some other bleeding heart. Danny remained calm, watching the point where the truck had vanished into the night. Maybe, he conceded. But what if you're wrong? What if he really does have a sick sister? What if that $40 makes the difference between him reaching her in time or not? Isn't that possibility worth the risk? Greg slammed his hand on the counter, causing the display of gum packets to rattle. Worth the risk? Worth the risk? His voice rose with each repetition. Let me tell you something about risk, kid. I've seen every scam, every sob story, every trick in the book. 25 years behind this counter, watching people like you throw away their money on lies. Danny maintained his calm, though his heart was racing. There was something different about Greg's anger this time. It felt more personal, more raw than his usual complaints. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as if sensing the tension in the air. They come in here with their stories, Greg continued, pacing behind the counter now. My car broke down. My wife's in labor. My kid needs medicine. And kind-hearted fools like you just hand over your hard-earned money without a second thought. You know what happens next? They drive off laughing, probably heading to the nearest bar to spend your $40 on cheap beer. You don't know that, Danny said quietly, straightening the gum display Greg had disturbed. You don't know his story? Stories! Greg exploded. That's all they are, stories. You want to know about real stories? Let me tell you about Jenny Chen, worked here 3 years ago. Sweet girl, just like you. Always wanting to help. Guy came in with a story about his dying mother, needed money for gas to reach the hospital. Jenny gave him her whole day's tips. Next week, same guy. Different story. When Jenny called him out on it, you know what he did? Laughed in her face. Danny absorbed this information, noting how Greg's hands were shaking as he spoke. One bad experience doesn't mean one? Greg's laugh was bitter. Try hundreds. Try watching person after person get taken advantage of. Try warning them and having them ignore you, then watching them come back with that look in their eyes when they realize you were right. You think I'm this way because I want to be? I'm this way because I've seen what happens when you trust people. The night air seemed to grow thicker with each word. Through the windows, the gas stations, neon signs cast alternating patterns of light and shadow across their faces, like some sort of visual representation of their moral debate. Maybe you have seen all that, Danny acknowledged, choosing his words carefully. But, Greg, has it ever occurred to you that being wrong sometimes might be better than never helping at all? Greg froze in his pacing. What? Think about it. Danny continued, gaining confidence. Let's say you're right. Let's say 9 out of 10 people who ask for help are scamming us. But what about that 10th person? The one who really does have a sick sister, who really did lose their wallet, who really is desperate? By treating everyone like a scammer, you're guaranteeing that person gets turned away too. Oh, spare me the philosophy lecture, Greg snapped, but there was a slight waver in his voice. You weren't here 15 years ago when Maria worked the register. Single mom. 3 kids. Man came in crying about his baby needing formula. She gave him $60. Money she needed for her own kids' dinner. You know what happened? Guy went next door. To the liquor store. Maria's kids went hungry that night. Danny noticed something in Greg's tone when he mentioned Maria, a personal pain that suggested there might be more to that story. That must have been hard to watch, he said, gently. Hard to watch? It was. Greg caught himself, seeming to realize he'd revealed too much. He straightened his uniform shirt with jerky movements. It doesn't matter. The point is you can't trust people. Ever. But that's just it, Greg. Danny pressed, sensing he was finally getting somewhere. Trust isn't about being certain. It's about being willing to take that chance. Yes, I might lose $40 tonight. But I might also have helped someone reach their dying sister. And if I have to lose $40 9 times to help that one genuine person in need, I think it's worth it. Greg's face underwent a complex series of emotions. You sound just like... He stopped, shaking his head. Never mind. You want to throw your money away? Fine. But don't come crying to me when you realize the world isn't the friendly place you think it is. The world is what we make it, Danny responded, his voice firm but kind. Every time we choose suspicion over trust, cynicism over hope, we make it a little darker. Every time we choose kindness, even when it's risky, we make it a little brighter. Oh, for crying out loud! Greg threw his hands up in exasperation. Listen to yourself. You sound like a greeting card. This isn't some fairy tale where good deeds get rewarded and kindness saves the day. This is real life, kid. Real life is messy and ugly, and people take advantage of idiots like you. Danny noticed movement outside, a car pulling up to the pump, but Greg was too caught up in his tirade to notice. You think you're helping people? You're enabling them. You're making it easier for them to keep scamming the next soft-hearted fool they meet. You're part of the problem. No, Greg, Danny said, his voice suddenly stronger than it had been all night. The problem is thinking that protecting yourself from being hurt is more important than helping others who might be hurting. The problem is letting fear of being fooled stop you from being kind. The customer outside was taking an unusually long time at the pump, but neither man noticed, too engrossed in their confrontation. You want to know what your real problem is? Greg's voice had taken on a desperate edge. You remind me too much of myself, 30 years ago. Before I learned how the world really works. Before I watched good people get taken advantage of over and over. Before He stopped abruptly, as if he'd said too much. Before what? Danny asked softly. But Greg had already retreated behind his wall of cynicism. Forget it. Just forget it. Go ahead and waste your money. Go ahead and trust everyone who walks through that door. With a sad story. Just don't expect me to pick up the pieces when it all falls apart. The automatic door chimed, and both men turned, expecting to see the customer from the pump. Instead, they found themselves facing the stranger from earlier. But something was different about him now, something that made both Danny and Greg take an involuntary step backward. The transformation was startling. Gone was the disheveled stranger in worn-out clothes. Instead, a man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit stood before them, his silver hair now neatly combed, his bearing radiating quiet authority. The only things unchanged were his eyes, still keen and observant, but now holding a different kind of intensity. Greg's face drained of color so quickly that Danny worried he might faint. Mr. Callahan? He stammered, gripping the counter for support. The stranger, Mr. Callahan, stepped fully into the store, allowing the door to close behind him. Good evening, gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying the same quiet dignity it had before, but now with an unmistakable note of command. I believe we have some matters to discuss. Danny's mind raced to catch up with what he was seeing. The name clicked into place. James Callahan, owner of the Callahan gas station chain, which included Miller's Gas and Go, and dozens of other stations across 3 states. But that would mean... I don't understand, Danny managed to say. The truck was borrowed from our maintenance department, Mr. Callahan explained, straightening his tie. The clothes came from a local thrift store. The story about my sister was fictional, though based on a very real experience I had 30 years ago, when I was just starting out in this business. Greg had still not moved from his spot behind the counter, his face a mask of shock and growing horror. Sir, I can explain. Mr. Callahan held up a hand, silencing him. Before anyone explains anything, I want to share something with you both. He pulled out his phone and pressed a few buttons. The security monitors behind the counter suddenly sprang to life, showing footage from the past hour, including every word of Greg and Danny's argument. You see, Mr. Callahan continued, pocketing his phone, I've been conducting undercover visits to all our stations over the past month. Not looking at sales figures or inventory management, we have regional supervisors for that. No, I've been looking for something far more important, humanity. He turned to Danny, his expression softening. Young man, what's your full name? Daniel Martinez, sir, Danny replied, his throat dry. Mr. Martinez, in the 6 years since I implemented these undercover inspections, you are Only the third employee who has offered to help from their own pocket. Not only that, but you defended your decision to help with eloquence and conviction, even in the face of significant opposition. He glanced meaningfully at Greg. Danny felt his cheeks flush. I just did what seemed right, sir. Exactly. Mr. Callahan smiled. You did what seemed right, without knowing who I was. Without expecting any reward or recognition. That's the kind of character we need in leadership positions. Greg made a choking sound, finally finding his voice. Leadership positions? Yes, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Callahan's tone cooled noticeably as he addressed Greg. You see, we're implementing some changes across all our stations. Customer service is becoming our top priority, and we need people who understand that sometimes compassion is more important than caution. He reached into his suit jacket and withdrew an envelope, holding it out to Danny. Mr. Martinez, I'd like to offer you the position of assistant manager, effective immediately. The envelope contains details about your new salary and responsibilities, along with reimbursement for the $40 you so generously offered to a stranger in need. Danny took the envelope with trembling hands, hardly daring to believe what was happening. A promotion? His mind immediately went to his mother, to the medical bills they were still paying off. This could change everything. As for you, Mr. Wilson, Mr. Callahan turned to Greg, whose face had progressed from pale to slightly green. We need to have a serious discussion about your future with this company. Greg seemed to shrink under Mr. Callahan's gaze. Sir, please. I've worked here for 25 years. Yes, you have, Mr. Callahan acknowledged. And in those 25 years, how many people in genuine need have you turned away? How many desperate travelers struggling, families, or lost souls have left this station feeling worse than when they arrived? The security footage continued to play silently in the background, showing Greg's angry gestures, his contemptuous expression as he dismissed the disguised owner. The contrast between his behavior and Danny's calm compassion was stark. I was just trying to protect the business, Greg protested weakly. There are so many scammers out there. The business doesn't need protection from kindness, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Callahan's voice was firm but not unkind. What it needs protection from is the kind of cynicism that makes customers feel unwelcome and employees feel afraid to show basic human decency. He pulled out another envelope. However, I believe in second chances, something you might want to start believing in yourself. In this envelope, you'll find two options. The first is a severance package, should you choose to resign. The second is an opportunity to undergo our new customer service training program, followed by a probationary period under Mr. Martinez's supervision. Greg's jaw dropped. Under his, but he's half my age. Age has nothing to do with wisdom, Mr. Wilson. You demonstrated that quite clearly tonight. Mr. Callahan checked his watch, a subtle but expensive timepiece that somehow hadn't been noticeable when he was playing the role of a drifter. You have until tomorrow morning to decide. Mr. Martinez will be implementing some immediate changes tonight, and I need to know if you're willing to be part of them. The next morning arrived with the sort of quiet anticipation that follows a storm. Danny arrived early for his shift, the envelope from Mr. Callahan tucked safely in his back pocket, its contents still feeling more like a dream than reality. The rising sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, where a crew was already at work installing new LED lights and giving the weather-beaten gas pumps a fresh coat of paint. Inside, the transformation was even more dramatic. A team of workers moved efficiently through the store, replacing the harsh fluorescent tubes with warmer lighting, setting up new digital displays, and organizing a previously unused corner into what would become a small seating area with a coffee station. First step in building community is giving people a place to sit, Mr. Callahan explained. appearing beside Danny. He traded last night's suit for more casual business attire, but his presence was no less commanding. A gas station can be more than just a place to fuel up. It can be a haven for weary travelers, a meeting spot for neighbors, a place where kindness is the rule rather than the exception. Danny nodded, taking it all in. What about the regular customers? The locals who are used to the old way? That's where you come in. Mr. Callahan smiled. Your promotion isn't just about managing inventory and schedules. It's about setting the tone, creating an atmosphere where every customer feels valued, whether they're spending 50 cents or $50. The bell above the door chimed, and both men turned to see Greg entering the store. He looked like he hadn't slept, his uniform more rumpled than usual, his expression a mix of resignation and uncertainty. In his hand, he clutched the envelope from last night. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Callahan acknowledged him. I trust you've made your decision? Greg's eyes darted around the store, taking in all the changes already underway. For a moment, he looked overwhelmed, almost lost. Then his gaze settled on Danny, and something seemed to shift in his expression. I want to stay, he said quietly. I want to learn, to do better. He swallowed hard, as if the words were physically difficult to get out. If you'll still have me. Mr. Callahan exchanged a glance with Danny, who gave a slight nod. The training program begins next week, Mr. Callahan said. But your real education starts right now, working with Mr. Martinez. Are you prepared to take direction from him? Greg's jaw tightened momentarily, but he nodded. Yes, sir. I understand. Good. Mr. Callahan checked his phone. Because your first test is about to walk through that door. As if on cue, the bell chimed again. A young woman entered, pushing a wheelchair with an elderly man who appeared to be her father. They looked tired, travel-worn, and more than a little frustrated. Our car's making a strange noise, the woman explained, approaching the counter where Greg stood. We've been driving all night to reach my father's medical appointment in the city, and now this. We're already running late, and we can't afford major repairs right now. Greg's face went through a series of micro-expressions, his old cynicism warring with his new resolution. Danny watched, holding his breath, as Greg visibly struggled with his response. Finally, Greg straightened his shoulders and did something Danny had never seen before. He smiled. It was a small smile, slightly rusty from disuse, but genuine. Let me take a look, he offered. I used to work as a mechanic before I started here. Maybe it's something simple. The woman's relief was palpable. Really? Oh, thank you. But we can't pay much. Let's worry about the car first, Greg said, already heading for the door. He paused, glancing at Danny. That is, if my supervisor approves? Danny felt a surge of pride, both at being acknowledged as supervisor and at Greg's evident effort to change. Of course. Take whatever time you need. Over the next hour, as the store's renovation continued around them, Greg worked on the visitor's car. Danny observed through the window as his formerly grumpy colleague not only fixed the loose belt but also checked their oil and tire pressure, explaining everything to the elderly man who had perked up with interest in the mechanical discussion. You see that? Mr. Callahan murmured, joining Danny at the window. That's the Greg Wilson I hired 25 years ago. Before life taught him to expect the worst from people. Sometimes people don't need firing, they just need reminding of who they used to be. When the father and daughter finally departed, their car running smoothly and their spirits visibly lifted, Greg returned to the store. His hands were greasy, his uniform even more disheveled, but there was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before. They tried to pay me, he said, almost wonderingly. The old man had a $20 bill he kept trying to give me. But I couldn't take it. It felt good just to help. Danny smiled. Feels better than assuming the worst, doesn't it? Greg was quiet for a moment, wiping his hands on a rag. I owe you an apology, he said. Finally. For a lot of things, but especially for last night. You were right about taking the risk to help people. I forgot that somewhere along the way. What changed your mind? Danny asked, genuinely curious. Greg glanced at Mr. Callahan, who was now reviewing renovation plans with the work crew. When he gave me the choice between leaving and learning, it reminded me of something. 25 years ago, when I first started here, I was a mess. Lost my job as a mechanic. My marriage was falling apart. Mr. Callahan took a chance on me. He didn't have to, but he did. I guess I forgot what it feels like to be on the receiving end of that kind of trust. 3 months later, the summer sun had just begun its descent when a familiar rattling sound drew everyone's attention. An old pickup truck, not unlike the one Mr. Callahan had used during his undercover visit, pulled into Miller's Gas and Go. The driver, a young woman with 2 small children in the back seat, looked anxious as she glanced at the gas gauge. Greg, who was straightening the newly installed coffee bar, caught Danny's eye. Without a word, both men understood this was exactly the kind of situation that would have triggered Greg's cynicism 3 months ago. But things were different now. The station itself stood as testament to that change. The once faded building now sported a fresh coat of paint in warm, welcoming colors. The cramped convenience store had been transformed into a bright, open space with comfortable seating areas and a small play corner for children. Local artwork hung on the walls, and a community bulletin board near the entrance was filled with notices, job postings, and thank you notes from grateful travelers. Welcome to Miller's, Greg called out as the woman entered, her children clinging to her hands. Can I help you with anything? The woman hesitated, clearly preparing herself for rejection. I hate to ask, but we're trying to get to my mother's house. Our car's running on empty, and I left my wallet. She stopped, pulling her children closer. Never mind. I'm sorry to bother you. Ma'am, Greg said gently. Please tell us what you need. We're here to help. Danny watched from behind the counter as Greg handled the situation with a grace that still surprised him. In the past 3 months, the change in his colleague had been remarkable. The customer service training had helped, certainly, but the real transformation had come from within, from remembering who he used to be and choosing, day by day, to be that person again. Let's see what we can do, Greg was saying, leading the family to the seating area. He grabbed 3 juice boxes from the cooler for the children, waving away the woman's protests. First things first, let's get you folks comfortable while we figure this out. The play corner, which Greg himself had helped design during the renovation, proved to be a perfect distraction for the children. As they played with the provided toys, their mother explained their situation, a sudden emergency, a rushed departure, a forgotten wallet. We have a program for situations like this, Greg explained, pulling out a form from behind the counter. It's called the Traveler's Aid Fund. Mr. Callahan, our owner, set it up specifically to help people who find themselves in tight spots. Danny smiled, remembering the day Mr. Callahan had announced the program. It had been inspired, he'd said, by his undercover experience at their station and the kindness he'd witnessed from Danny. The fund worked on a pay-it-forward system. Customers who could afford it would add a few dollars to their purchase, creating a reserve for those in genuine need. As Greg helped the woman fill out the simple form, Danny noticed something else. The tension in her shoulders had eased, replaced by relief and gratitude. It wasn't just about the gas money, it was about being treated with dignity, about finding kindness when she'd expected judgment. You know what the best part is? Greg said later, after the family had departed with a full tank and renewed hope. 3 weeks ago, a truck driver she helped came back through. Told me the whole story. How she'd shared her lunch with him when he was stranded, without his wallet. Said it was the kindest thing anyone had done for him in years. Danny raised an eyebrow. So she was the one? Greg nodded, grinning. The same woman who helped start our lunch voucher program for stranded truckers. Talk about things coming full circle. The evening shift continued, bringing its usual mix of regulars and travelers. Each person who walked through the door found something different from the typical gas station experience. Some noticed the fresh coffee and homemade sandwiches from local vendors. Others appreciated the clean restrooms and well-maintained facilities. But what everyone felt was the atmosphere of genuine care and community that had become the station's hallmark. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the newly paved parking lot, Mr. Callahan made one of his regular visits, no disguise this time. He'd been using their station as a model for implementing changes across his entire chain, often bringing other managers to observe what he called the Miller's Method. Quite a difference from 3 months ago, he observed, watching Greg help an elderly customer carry supplies to his car. Though I have to admit, I wasn't entirely sure how it would work out. Danny looked up from the schedule he was working on, a task that had become much easier since Greg had started volunteering to cover extra shifts and help train new employees. You took a chance on both of us, sir. Just like you did with Greg 25 years ago. Mr. Callahan smiled. Sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest moments of trust. He paused, watching as Greg returned, joking with a regular customer about the local football team. You know, he called me last week, asked about starting a mentorship program for new employees. Said something about wanting to help people the way you helped him. The night shift was winding down now, the steady stream of customers slowing to an occasional trickle. The coffee machine hummed softly in the background, and the newly installed LED signs cast a warm glow across the lot. Greg was showing a new employee, Sarah, how to properly close out the register, something he'd once done with barely concealed impatience but now approached with genuine enthusiasm for teaching. You know what I've learned? Greg said to Danny as they prepared to end their shift. It's not just about selling gas or snacks. It's about being that place, that one spot on a long road, where people know they'll find help if they need it. Where kindness isn't just a company policy, it's a promise. Danny thought about the $40 he'd given to Mr. Callahan 3 months ago, the best investment he'd ever made, though he hadn't known it at the time. We all need that. Sometimes, he agreed. A place where someone believes in us, even when we're running on empty. The last customer of the night was a young man who looked exactly like the kind of person Greg would have dismissed 3 months ago, tired, rough around the edges, uncertain. But now Greg greeted him with genuine warmth, and together with Danny, they discovered he was a veteran trying to reach a job interview 2 states away. Before the young man left, with a full tank courtesy of the Travelers Aid Fund and a fresh cup of coffee for the road, he asked them why they were so different from other gas stations he'd stopped at. Greg and Danny exchanged a look, and it was Greg who answered, because someone once taught us that sometimes taking a chance on people is worth the risk. And you know what? They were right. As they locked up for the night, the neon signs casting their gentle glow across the parking lot, both men knew that Miller's Gas & Go had become more than just a gas station. It had become a testament to the power of second chances, a reminder that it's never too late to change, and proof that sometimes the simple act of choosing kindness over cynicism can transform not just a business, but the hearts of everyone it touches.